Hey there and welcome back to another Avatar video. And today I want to talk about power levels. Because one of the big discussion points, or more aptly, one of the big points of contention within the Avatar fandom, is discussion about the setting of the Avatar world and comparing the content of both Avatar The Last Airbender and Avatar The Legend of Korra. And these discussions always seem to descend into immense flame wars across social media and other forums, especially when you get down to talking about characters and character interpretations. And naturally, people are always going to be comparing the main protagonists, the two avatars, Aang and Korra. Comparisons of their personality, their character arcs, their development, and of course, their feats and combat capabilities, which inevitably turns into a discussion of who would win in a fight. And why? And of course, this always gets people very heated because these two characters are quite beloved, both of them. And people rarely want to admit when their favourite character is maybe not quite as strong as you'd like to think they are. And so today, I figured I'd take a walk through the proverbial minefield and talk through who I think would be more likely to come out on top in a confrontation, and why. And before we begin, I'm going to acknowledge that Aang, he's my dude. And on the other hand, the creators I'm pretty sure have outright said that they consider Korra to be a stronger bender, which, I acknowledge that, so I don't think I'm going to be blinded by any bias. And of course, before we go, we need to establish some rules. They're in a generic battle zone where they have access to all the elements they need, there's no outside interference, and no running away. So they have to fight until one of them loses. And so, who's going to win? And first, I think you need to take a look at their generic abilities. As a fully realized avatar, you'd assume that by that point, Aang had gotten a handle on his use of the four elements. But when you arrive at the show's original ending, Aang is only the Master of Air, and is pretty much untouchable in that regard. But we're told by Katara that he does have a way to go with water mastery, and since she seems to have some pretty impressive waterbending feats, I'm willing to take her word for that. And it's the same with Toph. She outright tells him he needs more work with his earthbending, and once again, she is the earthbender, so I'll take her word for it. And fire, well, that's his least used element. By the end of the Last Airbender show, he's nowhere near mastery in that element, or really in any element besides air. Ozai beats his ass for a fair while in their original fight, until Aang manages to unlock his chakra and unleash the Avatar state, which blitzes Ozai completely and utterly. And don't get me wrong, Aang does have some pretty impressive feats throughout the show's run, but the majority of them revolve around his airbending, or his Avatar state, or his deeply spiritual, pacifistic and diplomatic mindset and personality. As an Avatar, his power seems to be more about inspiring others, being a figure to rally around, and helping people to see the bigger picture and resolve their disputes peacefully. I mean, the dude ended the 100-Year War simply through his intense desire to not kill somebody. To not kill the worst dude ever. Instead of being forced to do that, he literally goes into the sea to learn lost techniques that would ensure Ozai doesn't have to die. And thus, Aang doesn't stain his soul with bloodshed, and Ozai doesn't become a martyr. Not long after that, he successfully helps to defuse a second war, and alongside Zuko and his friends and allies, creates a brand new nation which would be a symbol of peace, unity and harmony within the world. All pretty impressive things. But the majority of his feats don't really revolve around fighting and combat. And that's not to say he's a bad avatar or a bad fighter, it's just that he has a pretty different style. When he does fight, throughout the entire show's run, he's not aggressive in his techniques for the most part, and he relies most heavily on his native element, air. And on top of that, he spent the majority of his early life with the air monks, training as a monk, living as a monk, living in a completely pacifistic society that promotes peace and harmony. We see in the Roku flashback that he's raised in the Fire Nation, a member of the court, a companion of the prince, trained as a firebender and a warrior, and then he spends years in other nations learning their own philosophies and techniques. And from what we've seen, I think the Water and Earth nations both seem to have a bit of a warrior culture too. But Aang doesn't get this experience. He spends most of his life with the air nomads, and his experience training with the other elements is done training with lone wanderers. Instead of sitting down with a true warrior master and honing his skills over years, he travels with his friends. He sees the common folk, and he learns about things that way. And whilst I think this teaches him about the people and gives him knowledge on how to understand and empathize with the people he needs to protect, it really stands in stark contrast to Korra. Because Korra, by the time we see her, has already achieved essential mastery in water, fire, and earth, and yet has no knowledge or ability in airbending. Over the seasons, we see that she does develop that skill alongside a bunch of others, like accessing the Avatar state, metal bending, spirit bending, energy bending. And as a result of all this, she pretty much becomes stacked both in terms of raw firepower and also in terms of Avatar spiritual powers. On top of that, compare her upbringing and her philosophy to Aang's. She's raised by her parents and the White Lotus in a secure combat compound where she's training as the Avatar 24/7. The true spiritual side of her training doesn't really start until she meets Tenzin, whilst Aang was born into that sort of thing. And so, before that, it seems like she was pretty much just becoming a warrior and mastering bending. On top of that, her physical condition is, very good. I mean, compare the pair, that's all you need to say. And so it's very clear just from the get-go that she's styled to be a much more warrior avatar than Aang. Plus, she kicks some serious ass throughout the course of her adventures, so she already has some pretty serious feats there. But does that mean she could defeat Aang? And I think it is hard to say. We've never really seen them both at a comparative age, and so I guess we'll have to see who takes the cake under a number of different conditions. And so our first round can be Aang versus Korra at the beginning of both their season 1s. And whilst Aang is an air master, Korra is an earth, water, and fire master. I really don't see how he comes out on top here, especially when they both seem to not really understand how the avatar state works at that point in time. And then add to that, he's a puny 12-year-old boy, while she's a swole 17-year-old. He really has no chance. But yeah, go figure. A 12-year-old losing a fight with a 17-year-old, it's not really rocket science. And honestly, even if you take them at the end of their respective shows, I don't think that Aang really has much of a chance. He has air mastery, yes, and he can use the avatar state at will, but his training in the other 3 elements is far newer. By comparison, by this point, Korra is a master of 3, and probably air by this point in time, and can also use the avatar state at will. So I think at the end of both their shows, he does put up a bit more of a fight, but it's still a relative stomp. But then, on the flip side, if you age Aang alongside Korra, I do think it does change some things. In Book 1 of Legend of Korra, she's 17. In Book 2 and 3, she's 18. And in Book 4, she's 21. So we'll do all of those, and of course the 12-year-old to represent little Aang. 12-year-old Aang gets stomped. We see that young Korra could already bend the majority of the elements. Aang only had air. He's toast. But then, when you jump forward to ages 17 and 18, Aang definitely stomps here. He's years out from the war and has worked through a lot more of his shit. He can use the avatar state at will and has surely by this point mastered all the elements. Korra at that age, she can't do that. She has her 3 masteries, yeah, but no real spiritual ability at all, and she can't airbend. So I think she gets slapped around quite significantly. At 18 it is a little bit better, but I do think she's still a bit of a relative noob to the spiritual side of being an avatar, and thus, our boy still gets the win with the avatar state. And on top of that, I actually wouldn't be surprised to see Aang eke out the win the majority of the time at age 21 either, because you have to take into context their own story arcs. Over the course of their shows, Korra and Aang both go through some pretty severe shit. But at the age of 21, Korra's is far more recent, in fact it's still ongoing, and she's not fully healed. Aang, whilst comparatively underpowered from a bending point of view, would probably be strong enough to outlast her in this scenario, as long as you're taking into account her 3-year struggles. And while she has had time to come back and train, I doubt she was ever at full strength even by the end of the season. Hell, at one point Kuvira defeats her, and I think that Aang at age 21 would absolutely clap Kuvira, so I'm thinking at this stage of the game, it probably goes either way, but I'd favour Aang. But of course, that all means nothing. Here's the definitive final round. Fully realised Avatar Aang, as in the one from the Yukon flashback, versus what you'd assume Korra would be like at that stage. Okay, and I think Korra wins, and she wins quite easily. Obviously, it would probably turn out to be the most glorious battle in history, 2 full power avatars going all out, but surely she wins. Surely. Aang, based on that flashback, is very powerful. But you've got to assume the same for Korra. You need to include that context, because now they're both well and truly past their traumatic events in their childhood. And they've both mastered all of the elements, and they've overcome numerous enemies. On top of that, they're both in touch with their spiritual selves, and they can use the avatar state at will. But at the same time, in a pure 1v1, I don't see how Korra can lose with any real regularity. Realistically, almost every time they clash, she should win, because it ultimately comes back to what's talked about earlier. She is the warrior, he's the diplomat, the peacemaker. It's the carrot and the stick mentality. In a fight, she would win. Water is her base element, so I'd assume she'd be the victor in that regard. On top of that, a lot of bending seems tied to your mental state and your personality traits. Korra's particular brand of ruthless aggression and unyielding stubbornness would surely translate into a more effective form of fire and earthbending than Aang could produce, at least from a combat point of view. She's also proven to bend metal, which I'm pretty sure Aang has not been shown to do. I mean, there's a good chance he was able to, but it's never been shown, so you can't really count it. And that's versus his air mastery, which, yeah, surely he'd destroy her with air. But that's 1 versus 3, and I just don't see how he wins. Especially when you take into account that the Avatar state amplifies your power. Surely she'd demolish him. But hey, on the other hand, at least Aang gets the consolation prize of having the most powerful team by far. Mako, Bolian, Asami, those are Korra's main group. I'm not counting the adults. Versus Sokka, Suki, Toph, Zuko, and Katara. GG Team Korra, you're out. But yeah, I tried to be fair to my boy because, he's my dude. My childhood. I love that little monk. But I just don't think he has it in him. There are elements of Avatardom that he's clearly superior in. But fighting, combat, I don't think that's it. I think he'd run rings around her in a debate, but maybe not in a 1v1. But of course, with all that being said, these are only my opinions, and I'd like to hear yours. Who do you think's stronger? Korra, Aang? Maybe you think they're equal? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.